we're delighted to move on to our next panel of today. Facebook knew I was gay before I did. I love that title, absolutely brilliant, and love that proposal from Kevin. And we have an amazing panel with us today. So our chair for today is Katie Go. So I'm going to pass you over to Katie. And a reminder to all of you watching online, please do send in questions via Slido. And of course, all of you in the room will take questions from you when the panel are ready. So over to Katie.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you can all hear me okay. I'm really delighted to be here chairing our event today. Facebook knew I was gay before I did, queer data, and the generative capabilities of AI. I'm just going to read a little introduction to the event, and then I will introduce our panelists, and we will get started. So whether you're scrolling social media posts, creating a dating app profile, or looking for a film to watch on Netflix, many everyday technologies involve putting users into boxes according to their gender and/or sexuality. But sometimes these boxes do not match how individuals understand or wish to present themselves to the wider world. So what happens when AI navigates the complexity of the closet? What are the ethical issues related to the disclosure of information about gender and sexuality? And did Facebook know I was gay before I did? A very personal, attacking question. These questions will be addressed in today's panel, which will explore the intersection of LGBTQ+ communities and the classification practices used by everyday technologies to make sense of genders and sexualities that depart from a cisgender heterosexual default. A lot to cover. So we're going to hear from our panelists for about 25 minutes, and then we're going to open up to questions for about half an hour. There will be ones coming in from Slido. If you're online, you can write them into the chat, or if you're in the room, you can put your hand up. There'll be a roving mic. So I'm really excited to introduce our speakers. I will start with Eddie, who is here beside me. Eddie L. Ongles, he/they is a final year PhD student in the Centre for Doctoral Training in NLP, funded by the UKRI. They have an interdisciplinary background spanning linguistics, psychology, digital media strategy, and computer science. His work addresses social bias in NLP technologies, wherein he champions an approach that builds on social science research to center human experiences in our understanding of AI harms. Welcome, Eddie.
Thank you.
Then we have Kevin in the middle. Kevin Guyan, he/him, is the author of Queer Data, Using Gender, Sex, and Sexuality Data for Action, and he's also a Chancellor Fellow at the University of Edinburgh Business School. He is currently writing his second book, which explores queer encounters with different classification systems in the UK, from hate crime reporting to dating apps. Welcome, Kevin. And then Nicola Osborne at the end, they/them, she/her, is manager of the Institute for Design Informatics at the University of Edinburgh, EDI and Industry Partnerships lead for the new UKRI AI Centre for Doctoral Training for Responsible and Trustworthy in the World NLP. A very long title, but a very cool one. And a co-investigator of the AHRC-funded CoStar Real-Time Lab. Nicola also manages Creative Informatics, supporting creative people to do innovative things with data. They are co-editor of the forthcoming book, Data-Driven Innovation in the Creative Industries, which is published this April.
It's on pre-order now.
Oh my goodness, how exciting. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. You're all very impressive people in your fields. I am not. I am a journalist who asks people big questions. So that's where I'm coming from. So therefore my opening question is quite broad, but I wanted to begin with asking you all kind of what's happening right now. So how AI is currently putting LGBTQ users in boxes according to their gender and sexuality. So we opened there with some examples of like Netflix categories, dating apps, that sort of thing. But I'd love to know like what that categorization looks like across different sectors that you're aware of. Who would like to nominate themselves to go first? Eddie?
Sure. Yeah, I'll go first. So yeah, in my work, I'm largely focusing on kind of generation and classification AI. I think the big problem is that these technologies rely on a simplification process. They need to get from kind of like raw data about people's identities to something that they can easily process. And often that involves kind of flattening people out and putting them into the boxes, such as binary gender, or breaking sexuality into a handful of options and lumping people together, or just disregarding data from people who are more diverse. So I think that's the principal problem, is like that simplification process is never going to be truly representative of the queer community. And yeah, I'll start, I'll leave some.
Yeah, I like that idea. And for me, this kind of sense of like the datafication of the queer body, that kind of what goes in one end, it comes out the other, and what's kind of lost in that transformation process. So my work is kind of looking at how some of this is being sold to us as being about diversity or inclusion. Actually, once some tweaks are made, some biases are fixed, and some LGBTQ people are counted, then it has this kind of veneer of being job done, we fixed that problem, but actually there's still a lot of lives and experiences which are lost in that transformation process. So for me, what I'm trying to do with my research and my writing is really kind of problematize this inclusion element and thinking kind of who is included, but who is also excluded, and how are things which are presented as being inclusive, kind of with this rainbow veneer, actually often are pushing lots of lives and experiences into the shadows.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with like all of that, and so I think often it's not coming from a place of, I work with lots of small companies who are building new things. It's often not coming from a place of trying to be malevolent in what you do. There are very big companies where you can maybe argue the case, but a lot of very small companies and startups things, they're just trying to do what they know about. And I think the biggest challenge with queer people and with diverse people of any kind, particularly intersectional queer people, so queer and disabled or queer and black or whatever, is that if the people who are building the tools don't understand that experience and what it is to be exposed by some data, or where those characteristics have an implication that is much bigger than just counting that they've reached that audience, it's very hard for them to design a system that actually facilitates that in the right kind of way, or only captures the data when it is useful to capture the data. Like, they know about GDPR, but they don't necessarily think about what the other impacts are of collecting that. So I think, yeah, all of those things plus.
Yeah, because my follow-up question to that is sort of like, is it a problem? Why is it a problem? I think that it's interesting because I feel like rainbow veneer is a really nice way of describing that, Kevin, because it's like, surely it's a good thing that LGBTQ people are being catered for by this technology. I'm more curious about sort of why this could be a problem. Why is it different when a person who is LGBTQ encounters this data, this technology, compared to, say, like a heteronormative cisgender person? Kevin, would you like to?
Yeah. I mean, I am interested in this kind of veneer of inclusion, or this kind of sense, like the promise of inclusion, but at what cost? So you can be part of the system, you can be part of our technology, but what do you have to give up to get access to that system? And I think for lots of queer people, they do have to give something up. They have to change themselves a certain way, put themselves in a certain box to get access to that system. So I'm interested in thinking, do we need to access that system? Actually, can we refuse offer of inclusion? Can we refuse to be invited? When we get invited to join this platform, this program, this app, can we say no? And often we can't say no. But I think what's specific about LGBTQ communities, and what's great to have a panel specifically looking at this, is around kind of, I guess, the history of knowledge and information about our lives, our communities, our relationships. And often that knowledge has been policed, it's been excluded, it's been removed from view. And I think tech, the internet, other kind of digital media spaces play a real key role in opening up those connections, those kind of networks of information and knowledge. And I think for LGBTQ people, they are geographically disparate, so they could be kind of in the borders, Glasgow, Highlands, anywhere in Scotland, you will find queer people. But at the same time, that knowledge isn't always passed down through your family or through your community, which you sometimes have that experience with other minoritized communities. So that kind of access to knowledge, I think, is a real specific uniqueness about this community, which you don't get elsewhere.
I think there's also a thing of how identifiably queer you are as well. So there are other diversity characteristics which are maybe visibly evident, and there are there are lots of diversity characteristics that are not visibly evident, but queerness in particular tends to be one where if you are in a hostile environment, or you have a family who is not supportive or whatever, there is the opportunity to not divulge that to some people you're engaging with and to divulge it to other people, or to divulge part of your queer identity to, you know, your work colleagues and a totally different one to your dating apps or your other kind of spaces. I say this as someone who had a very hairy and interesting personal boycott against me last week because of an erotic life drawing group that I'm in. Blurriness. But it was very much to do with kind of context collapse. In that case, there was an issue with sort of models having their queer life model, quite explicit queer life model identity exposed for them in social media platforms where they were not happy doing that. It wasn't that they minded being part of that space or being exposed on some social media platforms, but they had different kinds of contexts, and there's a concept of kind of context collapse where your different worlds, your different digital identities get blurred. The more data you bring together, the more risk of that there is, the more exposure there is of being kind of outed. And with AI, there's more kind of detection or inference about what your identity is that makes that a whole different ball game of, you know, exposure, whether or not you're queer, of your queer identity, you know, perceived, but also that potential to really blur lines and take out of your control which parts of your identity or sexuality are shared with which audiences. So for me, that's a really important part that it runs totally in parallel to that idea of information and cascading information.
I love that idea of kind of just, it's not even so much about who you are or what you do, it's about how you manage information about yourself.
Absolutely.
In the sense of living a queer life, it's about information management. Who you're sharing, how you're sharing, when you're sharing, is a really interesting way of thinking about it.
I don't want to like disparage any straight people, but it's maybe a different kind of thought process that goes through, because inherently if you're a queer person, you are querying your identity at some point in your life and maybe re-querying it lots of different times because our labels don't stay the same sometimes. And I think that sort of, that querying bit maybe gives you a more nuanced sense of what you disclose to which people, because there is a risk attached, which there maybe is not to some other identities. So I think it's just helping other people understand that.
I think another issue that is specific to queer identities and some other forms of marginalization is that there's often a mismatch between the identity and what your identity is perceived to be.
Yes.
And a lot of the data that's available online is labeled based on what you're perceived to be. So something I've been thinking about a lot is that, like, I imagine a lot of images of pride have been labeled by the photographer, not the subject. And therefore, you're getting the photographer's opinion of what that person's gender identity is or what sexuality they might have. And yeah, that issue of like who labels the data and who the data is about, they're not often the same. There's a new tool I've been using to dig around in a lot of the really big data sets used to train these models. And I found some like turf kind of like dog whistles appearing in the data set. So that's something I'm worried about as well, is that like the way certain communities are going to be represented is determined by not just out-group members, but hostile out-group members. And that feels like something that's, you know, a particular issue for queer people.
And yeah, you all sort of mentioned there about, you know, our language is always evolving and how we think of categories is always evolving. And yet, whenever you look at what categories are available with technology, it's usually very, very rigid classification systems. I'm kind of curious what you think about whether AI technology is actually just able to keep up with how fast our language is evolving. Even like an acronym, that could change in like 2 years' time. How do you think AI is currently keeping up with evolving language? Do you think it's doing a good job from where you're sitting? Eddie, what do you think?
I think it's a fundamental problem with AI is that it is always going to be a step behind. It's trained on this vast amount of historical data, or at least in the way that they're currently being designed. They're trained on this historical data, so they're always lagging behind. And in communities on the margins, I think that's especially where there tends to be more creativity with identity and more change. And like also these systems, they're statistical models, they pick up on frequent patterns, and people who are underrepresented in online data, be that because they don't feel comfortable expressing that side of themselves online, or be that because they are just a very small number of people. The model, the way it's designed to work is to kind of flatten out that level of nuance at the margins. So yeah, I think until we adopt a method of AI model development that kind of tries to center marginalized people and makes sure that it works for marginalized people rather than just working for the majority, the kind of plurality, as it were. This is always going to be an issue. Because, yeah, the model is doing what it's meant to do. It's picking up on frequent patterns. But if we want it to serve a purpose and help people, we have to inject some knowledge very deliberately.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really challenging. It's mirroring a lot of the other issues around AI and representation as well, in that it amplifies any of the existing inequalities that are there in terms of the data that's present. So that happens with, you know, global majority of people not being represented in image training sets, for instance. So like it can move really quickly. And I think some of the kind of social media use of AI not always positively, but sometimes moves quite quickly because the data set they're often using is the kind of current posts that are going on, and it's got a lively kind of set of posts. But it depends very much what the system is trained on, absolutely, and whether that is representative of a broad range of people and what geography they're used to dealing with, because terminology varies by geography, it varies by generation, like there's the kind of generational difference between who does and doesn't identify as non-binary, for instance, quite a big difference. So it depends so much on who its intended audience is, because often the intended mainstream audience is not diverse queer people, and what it's been trained on, yeah.
Yeah, and I think another issue with these models is they're designed to be as general purpose as possible, and sometimes that's just not appropriate. So like in the case of reclaimed slurs, both within the queer community or other marginalized communities, it's not as obvious as just like allowing the model to learn those terms, because you don't necessarily want the language model to productively use the, like I identify as a fag, so I'm going to use that term. Like, you don't necessarily want a language model to productively use that term, but at the same time, if you just exclude that from the training data, you're missing out on people like me who use that terminology in a kind of positive way. And that's, I think, a problem with the approach to technology that really centers and values portability and the ability to reuse technologies and use them as widely as possible. And there are just some contexts in which, you know, it's not appropriate to use that technology.
I think the only thing I can add from these amazing points is just around, like a lot of my work is around kind of general data collection exercises and things like the census, and actually the challenge that kind of queer communities often encounter is the comprehension of these terms among non-queer people. So if you're doing a large survey or a census or any kind of data gathering exercise, there's a risk in having a drop-down list of 15, 20 options if 99% of your respondents are straight, heterosexual, cisgender. There's a huge risk of false positives in those types of situations. So I know that things like the census in Scotland, which had new questions on sexual orientation and trans status 2 years ago, there was an understandable pushback around including the word queer because there was a belief that as a response option, straight heterosexual respondents wouldn't understand the word and might accidentally tick that box when actually, I mean, you're laughing, but I'm looking at testing data from the US. The US might be adding a new census question to its census on sexual orientation. And for the option, you have gay, lesbian, bisexual, and then for straight, the testing question includes not gay or lesbian. So again, the sense that straight people might not understand they're straight when being asked to kind of answer that question in a census. So again, that kind of, the different size of the groups is something to really think about, and how the risk of false positives in any data exercise is something which I'm mindful of in my work as well.
Yeah, I know we were talking before as well about the sort of strategic use of other categories as well, that sometimes queer people will fit themselves into the badly designed boxes because it's much more important to be counted than to have the label perfect. But that also then obscures that nuance further into the data. It's a real challenge.
And I think it's often seen as an easy fix for tech companies. We'll just add more and more response options. We'll give you 15 genders, 20 sexual orientations. But actually what's happening behind the scenes are all these groups just being lumped into one big bundle. Is it a performative, tokenistic act? And actually sometimes there is a strategic element to it as well. I might rather be in a big box with more people. I might classify myself as gay or queer to kind of maybe strategically subvert, play the system. Yeah. I think that agency I like as well.
Yeah, it's like my own experience of dating apps is they'll give me loads of gender options and I'll select the one that feels most right to me, and then they often ask a follow-up, which is like, okay, but do you want to be shown with men or with women? Because they actually can't handle that level of diversity. So yeah, it's going back to your point about the rainbow veneer. It's like they want to appear to be inclusive of trans people. They want us to use their platform, but they don't necessarily actually want to do the work of changing how their recommender algorithm works to encompass us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm just curious about, so if someone hears this and they think, well, is the solution not then just to like add more data, keep on topping it up all of the time, and sort of trying to give the algorithm or give the machine as much as you can from, you know, let's just put everything into that. Will that not solve the problem? I'm curious about people responding with that and what you think will happen if just more data is added.
I have strong thoughts. I'm happy for somebody to go first. I'm really in the anti-add more data camp. I think we could be spending years adding more and more and more data into a system that might fundamentally be broken. It might fundamentally be beyond repair, and we're wasting our time, our energy, our resources trying to fix something that should be abandoned. So I think the add more data approach is how the industry currently sees the solution to queer people. We'll just put more into the machine and hopefully the machine will figure it out. But actually, if the machine from the ground up is fundamentally rotten, the add more data answer won't solve it.
So I agree, but I also don't.
Okay.
Because I think representation really matters. So that's part of the reason we've got the panel here today. And I think there's always the risk that if you don't collect any data in this territory, then you don't have an idea of kind of how you're doing. So I also do quite a lot of EDI kind of monitoring. I've had questions on there. So we've been collecting sexuality data for a project I've been working on, but we haven't been publishing the results of it because we've been like, this seems like it's representative population to the extent there's any population data to base that on, because there isn't a good baseline data set for that anyway. But we haven't been publishing it because it doesn't seem like it's doing anything useful publicly, but privately it's very useful for us to see that we've definitely got representation from that community. There's other diversity data we publish quite publicly because it's important that other people understand that we're meeting those needs and things. It's to do with what we're queried on, partly. But adding endless data, no, I agree with you on. Like, it's where it's actually beneficial and purposeful. And I have spent unnecessary amounts of time talking about GDPR in my life. There has to be a purpose when you're collecting data. There has to be some kind of transparency on why you're using it. It has to be a reason for people to give you the data and to trust you the data too. And I think that's something that is often forgotten, that if you're collecting kind of monitoring data about diversity, why are you doing that? Are you going to reflect that back to people? Is that changing how you behave, or are you just collecting it so you can report it to funders? And I would always push back about collecting any data if you're not going to do anything useful with it. So I think it has to be purposeful, and it has to be really, there has to be a benefit towards it. But sometimes there's an element of data collection, even when it's broken, that is more beneficial than not, because it at least tells you that you're failing to reach people, or it tells you that you are reaching people and you can go to them for the much more reliable information on why that works or doesn't work, which I think I'd always advocate for.
Yeah. I think another issue potentially is looking specifically at these kind of large models designed to generate or classify, is that there's a safety concern for queer people when just adding more data. So if you wanted, for example, like I know from my own work that a lot of the image generation models produce very offensive images of different non-cisgender identities. But the problem is if you just then add more images of non-cisgender people, you suddenly have a nice labeled data set of non-cisgender people, which can then be used for nefarious purposes. So you're using it to try and improve representation. You make it public access because you're like, this is great, everyone should improve representation. And someone says, thank you for your nice labeled data set. I'm now going to develop a clocking machine that allows me to tell whether someone is trans from an image. Or, you know, a gaydar or whatever it is. And yeah, depending on the country you're in. I mean, nowhere feels particularly safe for trans people at the moment, but, you know, depending on the country you're in, the consequences of being in that data set or the consequences of a tool being trained on that data set can be fatal. And that's an issue, I think, that queer people particularly face when, you know, just adding more data is the go-to solution.
Yeah, that's really a good point. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to sort of move into sort of the, I guess, the user's point of view. You mentioned dating apps, Eddie, before, and the sort of nightmare of navigating those as a queer person. From my own experience, like when I used to be on dating apps as a bisexual person, if I swipe right on like too much of one gender, it would really limit that and like only show me like that gender. And I'd be like, no, but I want to see like hot people who are of different genders. I'd be like, stop just showing me all the men in the area. And like that was just very frustrating and being like, why is this, like, why am I having to like fight this machine? I'm just sort of curious about like that sort of like fine line between like sexual preference, sexual discrimination, and when it comes to dating apps, also pornography, AI influencing the user's sexual preferences. I was wondering what you think about that in your fields. Nicola, do you have any thoughts?
It's just about erotic life drawing, isn't it? I mean, I guess I think that is where some of that very dynamic response to a user is sometimes a bit misjudged. So Instagram thinks I am like 90% thirsty gay man and 10% perimenopausal lesbian mum, and it is correct, all in. But it does, it's doing a very dynamic thing. So again, if I click on kind of, I'm definitely not single, but like if I'm clicking on like images or engaging with content that looks a particular way, immediately, 20 seconds later, what I'm seeing will be kind of updated and changed to respond to that. I mean, in some ways that's like a usability design issue, but it is, it does seem particularly challenging when you're talking about kind of sort of hyper-specific identity markers and things. And I think it is, I don't think it's exclusive to queer people. I think certainly in the kind of context of pornography and stuff, it won't be exclusive to that. But I think there's a much bigger cultural question anyway about how much very niche elements of sexuality are more visible in a more sexually active part of the gay community, and how that changes what you then get back in terms of that sort of filtering. So sometimes it's like, it's coming from the people who use those spaces, and sometimes it's coming from the designers who don't know what to do with that. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a problem. I don't know how you fix it. I think it can make you feel like you're in a kind of little tunnel. It's sort of a challenge of a lot of kind of content filtering, and AI is just making it faster and more. But I think it's an existing thing that has just gotten more. Yeah. What do you think, Kevin?
I've got thoughts as well. I totally agree with everything you've said. I think for me, it's a really exciting area of work, the sense of generative AI, but in the sense that this kind of our encounters with tech and dating apps and porn is actually not just giving us what we want, but kind of shaping what we want as well, kind of changing our desires, changing our attractions. And how, I think for kind of queer people, there's a real problematic dimension to that. It does touch on taboos around, maybe we weren't born this way, maybe we are shaped by the technologies we use, maybe we are impressionable, maybe we are open to being influenced by algorithms, by AI. And I think that touches on a really contested political point around what it means to be queer.
Yeah.
But I think kind of tech and AI gives that way in, and that's why when the title of the talk is, or panel is, Facebook knew I was gay before I did. I think particularly for people who are questioning, wanting to find out, kind of discovering themselves in the world, I think our encounters with these technologies can play a really key role in kind of determining who we are, how we desire, how we make sense of ourselves in this world. And I think that is often a taboo subject, because politically we've had to kind of say we're born this way, this is how things are, but actually in reality, in my view, it's far more complex.
It is really challenging, that political point, because there's part of that strategic grouping of things as well, because there are lots of different types of queer identities, not all of whom agree with each other on any of these things. So yeah, it's such a challenge.
Yeah. I'm just aware of the time, so I have more questions, but I would like to bring the audience into it to make sure people are able to ask questions. I think we have a roving mic from a staff member. Yeah, thank you. So if you have a question, just put your hand up, and then if you're happy to say like who you are, where you're from, that'd be great, but you can also just ask your question. Do you want to go to the person in the blue hoodie first? Thank you.
Hi, Ellen, she, her. You're talking about the data and data sets and how they're all formed by the data they have. And even though we live in a more inclusive society now, I think we're in a stage on social media where there's a lot more open, negative responses to inclusivity. Personally, I know that makes me feel like I want to share my data a lot less, privatized handles, etc. Do you have a concern that when people are willing to give up less of their information because of that fear, that will negatively impact these AI models, large language models, to be more prejudiced?
Yeah, I think it's really likely. If a community feels these technologies aren't being used for their benefit and they get hesitant about sharing that data, then yeah, you could get to a stage where the kind of hateful content outnumbers. And yeah, it kind of goes back to my point earlier about the fact that some of the data about queer people online is not from queer people, it's about queer people, and those are two different things. And I think, the onus is on tech companies if they want these technologies to be representative, which they claim they do, is to actually work with queer communities to understand what is needed to make them feel safer. So yeah.
I think Twitter and X is like a canary in the coal mine for queer people removing themselves from a space. And Kevin and I are both still on that, and Eddie as well.
Yes.
But, that's probably a very, very thoughtful choice and a regular kind of going, am I happy with this space? Because I know a lot of people who have removed themselves from that space because they don't like how their data is being used, because they don't like how the response is taking place in that space. I think there's a huge risk that you make some spaces that are just a very narrow sliver of, a large but not very representative sliver of society because of that.
I think as well, we're speaking about LGBTQ plus communities. They're not a monolith. There's a huge amount of diversity and differential privilege within that.
Yes.
And I guess my concern is that in these more toxic environments, it might be a small cohort of the broader LGBTQ plus community who then become the kind of prototypical model for everything else. Yeah. So again, the risk with that is that these companies could still say there are some LGBTQ people being represented, but it is by no means a kind of full sweep of everyone's life and experiences.
Yeah, we were talking this morning about kind of the good gays and the bad gays, and like how well represented those things are in society, and how the level to which you are easily assimilated into people's kind of models of what a family looks like, or a couple looks like, or what sexuality looks like, is already much better represented, because it just, you can say you're doing the thing and also not actually engage in the actual interesting complexity of queer lives.
In the context of Scotland and the UK, most of these tech systems do include some
definitely some
queer people, some of the good gays, but the kind of the badder, the people who want to subvert, to break the rules, who don't fit into the boxes, can find themselves further pushed into shadows, because there's now this inclusive veneer of some people are counted, and your decision not to be counted is your fault because you're being difficult, you're being problematic, you're being a killjoy, and I think that's a real dangerous path that's going down.
Yeah. It's kind of reminiscent of the debate around whether kink has a place at Pride, that some people feel, like in order to be as accepted as possible, we need to get rid of this sexual side of queer identity. And similarly, a lot of social media sites, excluding X actually, but a lot of social media sites have quite strict rules on like nudity and what erotic content is allowed, and then queer people who are posting erotic content, they get that removed, they're no longer represented by the system, and then the algorithm encourages people to avoid posting that kind of content.
Yeah.
And
I think one of the interesting things there as well is that there is like some innate homophobia written into the algorithm, but also there's a lot of people who will target kind of queer makers of content and complain about them. And so partly the algorithm is being trained by getting lots and lots of complaints about particular kind of content from a particular kind of content creator, and partly what looks like an algorithmic response is actually a kind of human targeted harassment, essentially. And it's in that very blurry territory of that sort of horrible behavior by individuals to queer people, as well as the algorithm being trained and refined by that. We're such a cheery bunch.
Yeah. Next question, the person with the watch on the wrist.
Thank you. I'm Mike Barn from Historic Environment Scotland. You'd said that there was the potential controversy about you're born queer, but then can you be influenced in certain ways? Recently, we've seen a big shift in social media with neurodivergency, and it's popular to be neurodivergent. Social media actually helped me understand that I'm neurospicy, and I can see that being minimised by the wider media and the public. Is there a concern that that's now going to happen to the LGBTQ community, that because potentially this is going to be highlighting it to those, that it's then going to be marginalised and minimised and downplayed, and it's trendy to be gay and it's trendy to be queer? What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is where the generational thing is so interesting, right? So I think a lot of people who have talked about neurodiversity and have self-identified or been diagnosed, and there's a massive waiting list to be assessed for neurodiversity, which means it's very hard for people to know either way. Like the self-diagnosis, there's a really good reason for it. There is a generational thing there, that it helps it sort of people feel like they understand their identity in a different kind of way. And there's a parallel to that, I think, to young people who may identify as non-binary and queer because they don't want to fit into what they see elsewhere, which doesn't necessarily mean that they are what we would label as gay previously. And I think we just have to be fine that people use those labels in different ways. And I think with the threat there just comes people who are outside of that group and don't understand that that isn't people adopting a label for fun. That's people being critical and questioning about themselves, and people who tend to be critical of that, people who are maybe less thinking about what their own identity is, what their own identity has been previously, how that shapes what their choices are. It's a complicated thing. So yeah, I mean, there's always a concern that might be sort of minimizing those concerns or those real inequalities that are seen out in the world. But I think, I think there's a lot of young people. Like I think the surveys that I've seen most recently are that like majority of young people are kind of aiming towards some kind of non-cis straight kind of label. And I think that's very reflective of what they see as dysfunctional in the people who choose to label themselves as cis and straight, which is not necessarily the same as them being super queer in their choices, but might just mean they're just very open-minded and are totally queer in their choices. I'm fine with them doing that. I don't know how everyone else feels, but it does change how that labeling works for people. Yeah.
Something your question has made me think about is the kind of medical model of transness and the parallels with like the fact that you could identify, I'm just poking the mic, you could identify as trans but not be diagnosed as trans because you don't fit certain criteria. Similarly, I'm autistic but I'm not formally diagnosed because I mean I don't really see the point, but I think like I wouldn't necessarily fit some of the typical criteria because I was like raised female. And yeah, there's like this mismatch again between like what the medical community considers to be like you've passed the bar for what they consider to be trans enough or what they consider to be autistic enough or what they consider to be like ADHD enough. And then there's, you know, people's lived experiences that don't necessarily match up with that. Something I have been thinking about though with regards to kind of like ADHD talk, as it were, I think people posting about mental health and neurodiversity and online are kind of incentivized by the way these algorithms work to post controversial content, and perhaps not kind of intentionally, but I do have noticed people posting like, here are some signs that you might have ADHD, and then it's a list of things that loads of people do. And I think perhaps that's deliberate because they know that they're going to get a lot of hate engagement, like rage. It's kind of rage baity sometimes, I think, because people are going to be commenting saying either I do that, oh, I haven't thought about this side of myself before, or everyone does that, this is ridiculous. Either way, they're getting lots of engagement, and then that is the content that gets spread, not necessarily content that is a more nuanced reflection of what it is to be neurodiverse.
I think the only thing I can add is before this panel today, I had the pleasure of going to the Young Scot panel and their data around how young people are using AI. And I think, trying to remember, it was around half of their survey respondents used AI. And among that, the young people, around 2/3 were using it for information, for knowledge. And again, I have some concerns around kind of legislative developments which are trying to kind of censor, trying to limit online content. Again, lots of it's well-intentioned, well-meaning, but I think a side effect of things like the Online Safety Bill is the restriction and the kind of censorship of that information about what LGBTQ lives and experiences, and that kind of censorship of where do you go to access knowledge and information about people who are maybe like you if you're not getting that knowledge and information from your family, from your school, from your youth group. So again, kind of how do we access this knowledge and information? And I think historically that has been how these communities have been policed, have been restricted, is through that management of knowledge. And we see a kind of modern day iteration of that around attempts to kind of censor online content, I think, at the moment.
That's a great point, thank you. Any other questions? The person in the blue jumper. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Barry. I'm a high school student. I was wondering how you feel around the whole navigating coming out in such an online environment, because I think especially for trans people, trying to change the gender that social media sites have saved of people has got to be very difficult, and I was wondering your views on that.
Yeah, I think one of the issues is even though you can maybe change the official settings, the kind of like cookies they have on you is another thing. So like Google allows you to go in and see what information it's kind of classified as you. And like I have health anxiety, and I was in Google as like a 25-year-old female nurse. I think based on my like search history. But in that, just like, am I dying? Just like on a really regular basis. But yeah, I can go in and tell it. I told it like, I don't want you to track what career you think I'm in. And I can change the gender and stuff. But I don't think that necessarily then manifests in what I'm showing. So like, I think advertising. The content I get advertised on Instagram, it really can't decide. Occasionally it gets it really right, and it's like, you're this particular flavor of gay man, and like, these are the clothes I'm going to show you. But then because I have very small feet, I buy women's shoes, and then it's like, oh, you're a woman. Here's some dresses, here's some things you might like, and I'm just like, no. And I think, yeah, it's frustrating that we don't really have that much control over how these platforms see us. They've built this profile of us, what they think we are like, and sometimes we can make some tweaks to that. But often you either have to kind of really consistently behave in a certain way so it gets your clues, or you just have to accept that it has this inaccurate image of you and it's going to be giving you inaccurate information.
There's like a worry for me as well, kind of taking things a step before that, and the kind of the chilling effect that the kind of political context has on how people use the internet, whether you're trans or a young person, that you might not even want to kind of share any information about yourself because there's a risk of being outed, being targeted, being harassed. So that kind of self-policing, that self-regulation that's happening, you might not even be aware it's happening to you, but this kind of monitoring of how you perform and how you are in your online presence, I think could be something deeply entrenched in how people use the internet and use technology. And that's a real kind of chilling factor that can't be easily kind of fixed by kind of debiasing, or can't be easily fixed by introducing regulation, because it's happening at the level of the kind of the core of who you are and how you wish to engage with these technologies. So that is something that worries me, that might be a kind of an offshoot of the current political context.
Yeah. It's really difficult. So I did about 10 years ago, my colleague Louise Connolly and I did some research on digital footprints and digital tracks and traces with students. And at that stage, telling people to think about what they posted online and that it might have consequences, like, you needed to have that conversation because they hadn't necessarily been doing that since school. And by the time we'd finished doing that work, so 4 or 5 years later, we didn't need to tell people. They knew because they'd seen the consequences themselves. I count myself very lucky, I'm in my 40s, to have made lots of mistakes online as an older teenager when it first appeared. I've been very old. Because I got to make those mistakes without them being remembered. And it is quite hard. Like, things do disappear online. I think it's probably worth just reassuring people of that. Like, the data doesn't always end up connected to you. Stuff does get lost. There's stuff I wish hadn't been lost that's online. But it's a really different context to grow up in now. And it's a really different context for very young people to grow up in as well. That sort of the identity you form. I don't even want to think about being sort of 12 or 13 or something and trying to form my identity in public. That's a really different kind of thing than I went through as a teenager. And I'm aware right now, I've got a small child, 6-year-old. I'm aware that what I post also has a consequence potentially for her. And so I'm more mindful than I used to be about how kind of holistic my presence is, although I'm still quite blendy. But it's sort of, it's a really challenging thing. I think you're right, sort of self-policing and self-censorship of identity is probably the right tactic that a lot of people are using, but it does mean that you miss out on lots of things. And lots of my discovering micro identity was online. It was online in a very small village. I was engaging with strangers on the internet as sort of a 17, 18-year-old, and I kind of knew a bit about myself, but I hadn't explored things sufficiently with other people. And that allowed me to make all kinds of lovely risk-based things that I would not probably advocate people do now. But like, it was very helpful for me. The internet was very empowering for me. And I think it's sad if we lose all capacity to do some of that kind of boundary pushing and risk-taking. At the same time as I would always try and tell people who are sort of younger people to be protective of yourself, and older people. You can make terrible decisions at any age. And they can last with you at any age. So, yes.
That should be the takeaway from this panel. You can make bad decisions.
You can make terrible decisions at any age, yes.
Do we have any more questions from people in the room? Oh, in the jacket on the left, please. Thank you.
Hi, Richard Salmond. Can I ask a question from the other end of the scale? So the reaction of the algorithms and the fast turnaround, etc., magnifies the hate as well. It magnifies the whole, so that people think it's acceptable to behave that way. They see other people doing it, etc. How do you think we can influence that? I mean, control's probably a bit strong, but what can we do to minimise that, or to stop that having the chilling effect that you were talking about?
I think with recommender algorithms, part of the problem is they reward interaction, whether that's positive or negative. So sometimes, like I keep being promoted threads because I have an Instagram account, and it's like, you're interested in trans things, here's some popular trans things, but the popular trans things are people complaining about how much hate they get on threads. Or it's like hateful posts about trans things because it's had a lot of interaction. So there's like a, the kind of algorithms are a bit blinkered to the actual like positive versus negative interaction. I think on the side of like generation algorithms, part of the problem is that like current attempts to kind of clean the training data to try and make the algorithms produce less hateful content, like they're always too simplistic. So like ChatGPT has been designed not to output hateful content, but like it's very easy to trick it into posting hateful content, and like, you know, people are more creative in their hatred than the people who build these systems thought they might be. Like for a while you could get it to write Dr. Seuss poems that were like incredibly offensive and said things that they normally the system would be prevented from saying. That they've patched that. But yeah, like there's just this kind of mismatch between like the amount of regulation that happens, or like the amount that the companies bother to do, and then like people who are motivated to get the system to do something offensive.
I think it's a really tricky problem. So one example I want to share is from the dating app Tinder, where they've used AI to kind of screen messages shared in private chats, and will use kind of prompts or nudges to try and dissuade people sharing hateful content in private conversations. So if you're a way to send something to somebody on the dating app that's extremely offensive, a box will pop up and say, do you really want to send this? And the data from that intervention is actually really good, that in a lot of instances people didn't send the message because the box popped up and said, do you really want to send this message? But my concern is there's a value judgment there in terms of who's deciding what's offensive and what's not offensive. As Eddie mentioned earlier around slurs, if you're using slurs in these private chats, the AI will pop up with a box saying, do you really want to send this? And it's perfectly fine conversation in the context that it's happening. So these kind of techniques and tools are always introducing kind of subjective decisions, which ultimately will represent the views of some people and not others. So I'm not sure. In the terms of Tinder, it did reduce the number of hateful messages shared, so there's definitely some benefits to it. But again, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of why people are doing this in the first place.
Yeah. I think there's lots of opportunities for people to come in, for queer people, for diverse people to come in and design systems that really mess with those sort of hate amplifying systems. So a parallel going on in the kind of creative sector at the moment, there's a tool called Narcissus, I think, which is designed so that artists can essentially make their images very human readable, but they totally mess up any generative AI that wants to use those images to steal their style and steal their work. There is going to be some equivalent of kind of inventive thought of how we mess with these systems, and that will have a positive effect, I think. And I think there is also there is a much wider conversation about, like, you know, Rachel's sort of keynote this morning, she's talking about sort of, do you need to use AI? What is the purpose of using it? We will get over this hump of like everyone trying to algorithm the heck out of everything because it's not actually useful. So there will be a little bit of hope, I think, there. But there are also some nice kind of, I guess, kind of resistance mechanisms already on some of the social media platforms too. So there's an Instagram account called The Black Project, and I think about once a week they'll post a picture of, like, I don't know, Leonardo DiCaprio or Taylor Swift or something, and it will hit your feed because that is a thing they recognize as a nice, white, interesting, famous person. And they ask everyone to kind of like that and use that, and then they put in the text of that post what you've missed that's important in kind of black and golden majority kind of issues, and then please go back and read the rest of the feed. And it's a really clever way of using that algorithmic prioritization to just mess with it. And I can't imagine anybody who's pictured in those pictures minding. It's like the loveliest way of disrupting what's going on. And I have to say, I always see those posts, and I never see their other posts, and it always is the thing that I then go back and make a point of doing that. So I think there are ways that we can mess with things, and that would seem to fit very much into kind of previous queer political movements anyway, to mess with stuff. So I would suggest that might be an effective tactic too.
Yeah, it's a nicer way of looking at the point I made about people being more creative than the people designing these systems. Yes, that can be used to do something hateful, but it can also be used to kind of create new spaces for expression of marginalized identities.
Good disruption.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. I think there was someone had their hand up on the right side before. Yeah, in the black. And I think this will probably be our last question, sadly.
This might be a very short question, we shall see. With, in theory, the death of cookies coming in the next couple of years, how do you think that will affect the kind of stuff you've been talking about today?
Do you mind repeating that? I didn't properly hear.
Sorry.
The death of cookies, okay.
Yeah, death of online cookies and how that would affect what you've been talking about, if at all.
I think it's potentially quite good. I don't know, I quite like all the discounts on men's shirts that I get. I will miss those, I buy a lot of suiting. I think potentially a very useful thing in terms of traceability across sites. If you actually look at how many cookies and what you're being asked for permission on, I had one the other day that was like, looking at a local newspaper site, I think it had something like 2,000 different providers will have data shared. Do you want to share data? Hell no. So there are usefulnesses to cookies, but I don't think that would be a bad thing to have cookies disappear. It's not like all the profiling is going to go away. It's not. There's a lot of inference going on that has post-dated that, really.
Yeah, it's still going to be profiled within the individual site. And I think they'll find new ways to then sell that data to advertisers. But yeah, hopefully it'll stop the kind of like being haunted by things across the internet.
Great. Well, thank you so much to Nicola, Kevin, Eddie for your brilliant thoughts. I feel like you've given all of us a lot to think about. So that's it. Thank you so much for coming along. And I think, are you going to hand back to me? Yes, I'll hand back to you.